Chapter 15. Doc sighed as he packed his notes into a small bag and placed it next to his personal belongings. 2 days was never enough time for a miracle. He surveyed the room for the last time and flashed a grin at Jake's somber expression. "I might be able to deceive them, or perhaps they'll play along for a bit," he said. "Regardless, now that they've agreed to take me and my notes instead of the cure we've run out of, I must be on that shuttle when it departs for their men at the orbital station." Jake nodded. "I don't like betraying friends, Doc, but it wouldn't do you any good to perish with the planet, I suppose. They won't halt the war rockets when they capture you naturally. Perhaps they won't use them, except as a threat to put the lobbies back in, stronger than ever," he said. He extended one of his oddly shaped hands, put on the respirator, and left in a hurry. Doc picked up his luggage and headed towards the small tractor where Lou was waiting to take him and Stan back to Southport and the shuttle rocket that would be landing for them. They hadn't mentioned Stan in their demands, but her father must expect her to return. After they had him, he'd be on his own. His best course of action was probably to insist on talking only to Tanana at medical lobby and then be completely honest. The room would be sealed in case the lobby wanted to investigate where he had failed. And his notes were honest, which was something that could usually be determined. Stan could testify to that since she had kept a lot of them for him. At best, there would be a chance for some compromise, and perhaps a clue for them that might eventually end the plague. They had enough people to work on it, and billions in equipment. At worst, he should gain a little time. "Cheer up, Stan," he told her as he climbed through the airlock. "Maybe Harkness will find the cure before our negotiations break down. He has the whole of Northport Hospital to work with. They haven't tried to chase him out of there yet. After all, we almost found something with no equipment except wild imaginations." She shook her head as the tractor began moving. "Shut up! I have enough trouble without your coming down with Logorrhea. Don't be a fool." "Why change now?" he asked her. "Everything I've done has been because I am a fool. I guess my luck lasted longer than I could expect, and I'm still foolish enough to think that the solution has to turn up eventually. We know it has to be in that room. Damn it, we must know it if we could only think straight now." She reached over and touched his hand but made no comment. They had gone over that statement of desperation too many times already. But it kept nagging at him. Something in the room, something in the room, something so common that nobody noticed it. They passed a crowd chasing down a runner. Something in that room could have saved the unlucky man. It could have saved Mars, perhaps. He growled for the 100th time, cursing his fatigue-numbed mind. Too little sleep, too much coffee and bracky. He reached for the package of weed, realizing that he would miss it on Earth if he ever got there. Like everything on the planet, he had begun by detesting it and wound up finding it the thing he wanted to keep forever. He lit the bracky and sat smoking, watching Lou drive. When the first one was finished, he lit another from the butt. She put out a hand and took it away. "Please, Dan. I can tolerate it, but I'll never like it, and the tractor's stuffy enough already. I've had enough of it." The memory of the three of them smoking and puffing while he struggled for air kept replaying in his mind. She was now rambling on, and suddenly the answer hit him like a ton of bricks. He grabbed Lou's shoulder and motioned for him to head back. "Bracky, it has to be. Stan, that's it. Jake picked out the second group of men from his friends, and they are all cronies because they hang around so much in their so-called smoking room. The first time, it killed the bugs for all of us who smoked, and it didn't work for you because you never learned the habit." Lou revved up the tractor, and they headed back, but she wasn't fully satisfied. "The percentage of immune seems about right, but why do some of the smokers get the disease while some don't?" he pondered. "Why not? It depends on whether they pick up the habit before or after the disease gets started. Tom must have got his while he was in Northport. They wouldn't let him smoke there, if he had the habit before, for that matter." He couldn't find any fault in his logic, but they couldn't send a message that bracky was the cure and hope that Earth would prove it true. They had to be sure. Too many other ideas had proved wrong already. Jake saw them coming and came running toward the laboratory, but Lou stopped the tractor before it reached the building and let the older man in. "Get me a dozen men who have the plague. I want the worst cases you have, and ones that Harkness tested himself," Doc ordered. "And then start praying that the cure we've got works fast." They began testing at 10-minute intervals, and one of the doctors Harkness had brought to the villagers was busy cutting tiny sections from the lumps on the men's necks, while Stan ran them through the microscope to make sure the bugs were still alive. Doc handed each man a bracky weed, with instructions to keep smoking, no matter how sick it made him. There were no results at the end of 10 minutes when the first test was made. The second, at the end of 20 minutes, was still infected with live bugs. At the half-hour, Stan frowned. "I can't be sure. Take a look, Dan," he said, moving the slide to examine another spot. "I think so. The next one should tell." There was no doubt about the fourth test. The bugs were dead, without a single exception that they could find. One by one, the men were tested and left in a frenzy, shouting the news. At first, the crowd was doubtful, recalling the previous failures. Then, suddenly, the men were screaming, crying, and fighting for the precious bracky, like the damned grabbing for lottery tickets when the prize was a passport to paradise. Jake cursed as he headed towards the door. "We're low on bracky here. We have to get a supply from Edison, I guess, and transport it to the shuttle. Enough for a sample and to make them want more. It'll be tough, but we'll get it there in time. By the time the shuttle should be picking you up. Doc, you've won our war. From now on, if Earth wants to keep her population up, we'll be a free planet." Stan turned away from the microscope, holding a slide in her hands. "My bugs," she said in disbelief. "Dan, they're dead." Jake patted her shoulder. "That makes it perfect, girl. Now come on, we have to start celebrating a victory." It was the general feeling of most of the heads of the villages when they met the next day in Southport, using the courtroom that had been presided over for so long by Judge Ben Wilson. It was a victory, and the victor deserved the spoils. The bracky had been sent out to Earth on a converted war rocket that could make the trip in less than 2 weeks, and one packet had been specially labeled for Captain Everts. But Earth had already confirmed the cure. The small amounts of the herb found in the botanical collections had been enough to satisfy all doubts. Harkness, Stan, and Doc had been fighting against the desire to rob Earth blind that filled most of the men there for hours now. Now they had the support of Jake and Ben Wilson. Finally, they leaned back, sensing that the argument had been won. Bargaining was acceptable in its place, but it had no place in matters of life and death like this. They had to ensure that Earth received all the bracky she needed. It was only fair to charge a reasonable price for it, but they couldn't withhold or overcharge, and they could still achieve their goals without blackmail. Martian alkaloids were complicated, and bracky smoke contained several of them. It would take Earth at least 10 years to discover and synthesize the right one, and it would still likely cost more than it would to import the weed from Mars. As long as the source of that weed was on Mars and in the hands of the colonials, there would be no threat of Earth bombing the planet. Harkness rose to emphasize a point that Wilson had made. "The plague has existed for 1,000,000 years, and it won't vanish now. The jumping headache, or Selznick's migraine, is unpleasant enough to make us reasonably sure that there will be a steady consumption of the weed. Our challenge will be to keep the children from using too much of it, probably." He pulled out a weed and lit it, puckering his face as the smoke stung his tongue. "I'm told that this becomes an enjoyable habit." The men of the village were human, and they still remembered the fear they felt when they thought their loved ones would die at any moment. It made them want revenge, but now that they had a chance to reconsider, they found it difficult to impose that kind of terror on others. The final vote was almost unanimous. Doc listened as they argued over the wording of the message to Earth, feeling detached from it all. He handed Stan a cigarette and lit it for her. She took it automatically, smiling as the smoke filled her lungs. At least they had that in common now. Ben Wilson read the message aloud. "Greetings to the people of Earth. On behalf of the free people of Mars, I am honored to declare this planet as sovereign and independent. We will always consider Earth our mother and prioritize the health and well-being of her people in matters that affect both planets. We hope that Earth will reciprocate this feeling of mutual friendship and that all hostility will cease. The benefits of peaceful commerce are too great to ignore. We will consider Earth's order for all rockets orbiting Mars to deliver themselves safely into our hands so that we can convert them for peaceful purposes and trade. In return, we promise to deliver the most in-demand products, including the curative brachyplant, as quickly as possible. Ben turned to Doc. Do you want to sign it, Dr. Miley? You can be acting president until we have an official election. You and Jake can fight over that, Doc replied. No, Ben, I mean it. He got up and went to the other room, away from the stares of amazement. He never asked for this honor, and he didn't want it. Stan followed him, looking shocked and drained. Forget it, Stan, he said. You're going back to Earth. There's nothing for you here. But there could be, Dan. You know that. No, Stan. I don't think there ever could be. You can't find a strong enough man who would also be weak enough to let you rule in his place. It didn't work on Earth, and it won't work here. Forget the dreams you had about what could be done with a new planet. Those are the dreams that ruined the old one. I'll be back, she told him. Someday, I'll be back. He shook his head. No, you wouldn't like what you find here. Freedom is intoxicating, but you have to have a taste for it. You can't develop an affinity for it second-hand, and for a while there will be liberty here. Moreover, once you return to Earth, you will forget what occurred here. She sighed at last. For the first time since he had known her, she appeared to surrender completely, and for that brief moment, he adored what she could have been, but never would be. All right, Dan, she said quietly. I can't oppose you. I never could. I see now. I'll take the rocket back. What are you going to do? He hadn't bothered to think, but he knew the answer. Research. What else? There would be a lot of research conducted here. It had been suppressed for too long and had accumulated a back pressure that would have to be released. And from that research, he suspected, would come the end of the stable oligarchy of Earth. It could never withstand the changes that would be pouring out of Mars. She placed her hands on his shoulders and leaned in to kiss him. He bent down to meet her and found her eyes were moist. Maybe his were too. Then she broke free. You're a fool, Dan Miley, she whispered, and began moving down the hallway and out of the council hall of Mars. Doc Miley nodded slowly as he let her go. He was a fool. He had always been a fool, and always would be, and that was why he could never take over leadership here. Fools and idealists should never govern a world. It took practical men such as Jake to do that. But the practical men needed the foolish idealists too, and maybe for a time here on Mars, their kind of men and his kind of fools could make one more attempt at the ancient puzzle of freedom. Outside, the war rockets of Earth began landing quietly on the free soil of Mars. The end. This concludes The Outcast, a science fiction novel. By Sven Torkelson. Narrated by Alexander Atkins. We thank you. You could have picked from dozens of other books, but you took a chance and chose this one. So thank you for listening to this book and for making it all the way to the end. Visit morrisbookshop.com for a very special bonus offer and to be notified when new books come online. Again, that website is morrisbookshop.com.